You're watching 12 WKRC-TV, a new generation of news. This is 12 Newsmakers.
Good morning and welcome to Newsmakers. With Americans fighting, dying, and being injured in Iraq, Veterans Day this past week took on an even greater significance than usual. In the second half of the program, I will be joined by a spokesperson for the Disabled American Veterans, which is headquartered locally in Cold Springs, Kentucky. But we begin this morning by remembering the powerful story of one group of World War II veterans. In a special Newsmakers report, 12 News reporter Jeff Hirsh and photographer Gary Werdeman look at one of the worst tragedies in U.S. military history and its connection to the tri-state, then and now.
When you're 13 years old, the people who fought in World War II can seem as distant as, say, the explorers who discovered the New World.
John Cabot. Leif Erikson is correct. Bobo is correct. It's important to know who these people are.
To a kid, almost ancient history.
Yeah.
But actually, here at Wyoming Middle School, World War II was a lot closer to these children than they could ever realize.
I remember them, and I remember when I saw that one, I'll never forget that. All I had was my shoes and skippy shorts on, and I bumped into them, the two twins talking, and this one was burnt completely black, and he was talking to his brother, just like nothing happened. And he started up the ladder, and he just dropped. That was it. And I'll never forget that.
Oh, hear us when we cry to thee for those in peril on the sea.
The Navy hymn, sung at the USS Indianapolis Memorial, in the city for which that ill-fated cruiser was named. Every 2 years, survivors of the worst disaster at sea in U.S. naval history gather here to remember. Some can barely walk, but all can still snap off a salute with pride.
It feels like every time we come here, it's like on sacred ground.
God be with you till we meet again.
On the wall at this sacred ground, names of 880 sailors and Marines, including a dozen from greater Cincinnati, killed when the Indianapolis was torpedoed and sunk by a Japanese submarine in 1945, just 2 weeks before the end of the war.
And 5 minutes after midnight on the 29th, this thing got hit. Sunk in 12 minutes. I was topside.
Only 317 none from Cincinnati survived, rescued after struggling desperately to stay afloat for 5 days in shark-infested waters.
We saw the men already jumping off of the rafts, coming to us. They just couldn't believe that they were alive.
Two of the names on the wall, two of the 880 who were not alive, 20-year-old twin brothers from Wyoming, Ohio, Seaman First Class Albert Kogler and Ship's Cook Third Class William Kogler. The same names Wyoming students can see on the War Memorial plaque at their middle school. During World War II, what is now Wyoming Middle School was the entire Wyoming school system, K through 12 in this one building. The Kogler twins moved into Wyoming as juniors and joined what would become a 44-member graduating class. They quickly became friends with kids who'd been in Wyoming their entire lives.
They were tall and thin, Bill and Al.
William S. Matthews was 1 year behind the Kogler twins at Wyoming High School. A football star who was voted best personality, Matthews meant something to Bill and Al, each nicknamed Kogie. In their senior wills, tragically ironic for two young men who were soon to die, the Koglers left Matthews a memory.
We, the Koglers, will the Norwood roller rink to Bill Matthews. We used to go over there and roller skate and probably hope to pick up girls.
Life in Wyoming back then was pretty serene. But the outside world was impossible to ignore. Wyoming could only insulate you for so long.
Back in those days, the idea was going into service.
For the Kogler twins, it was an imperative. According to their obituary, the brothers were inseparable since childhood and joined the Navy after graduation in 1943, together till the end.
Horrible death, huh? If anybody was burnt, injured bad or something, a lot of them didn't last.
Indianapolis survivor Eugene Morgan was one of the last to see the Kogler brothers alive. But the Koglers were not the only men from Little Wyoming, Ohio on the Indianapolis. Incredibly, this small town with only 4,400 people had a third sailor on board.
That's a picture of Dave when he was home on leave that spring. That was my birthday present that year. And that's the rock wall that he built in the backyard. And he brought me a sailor suit home. So that was a picture we had taken on the wall.
Now, the name of Seaman Joseph William Long is on another wall, the memorial wall where the reunion ceremony is held. At age 38, Long was one of the oldest enlisted men on the Indy. While the Koglers have no surviving relatives, William Long left a wife and 2 sons, the boys ages 12 and 6 when the ship went down. Denny Long was that 6-year-old.
All through your life, you wonder maybe what your life would have been like had he come home.
Denny Long does not know how his father died, killed in the initial torpedo attack, or perhaps wounded and bleeding, unable to survive for nearly a week in the ocean. In fact, only about 300 of the 880 fatalities died when the Indianapolis exploded. All the other deaths were in the water.
You kind of hope he was one of the first 300, rather than going through that horror of, being out in the ocean like that for 5 days. That must have been horrible.
Horrible cannot even begin to describe it. The Indianapolis was hit by 2 torpedoes from the Japanese submarine I-58, 12:05 a.m., Monday, July 30th.
A lot of the guys were coming up and down below, and I grabbed one guy by the hand like it, and he just slid out and
burned.
All burned up. It was hell.
But the hell on board was soon replaced with hell in the water. Cletus LeBeau is now chaplain for the Survivors Association.
Pray that our ship and its crew will be remembered as a unit that was willing to do what it took to defend our country.
But in 1945, Cletus LeBeau was a Navy man who, in the water surrounded by sharks, knew he'd either be going home or going to God.
I do know the sharks. They hear them scream and everything, and the water was churning bloody. We could see them swimming down below us when we would float in and out of the oil slick the ship left. When we was out of the oil, we could see them swimming around and going around us. They'd come up to the edge of the net where single guys, stragglers, got off or something. They'd get them. I seen them hit some guys that were alive, and I seen them take guys that were dead too. One man tells a story about one of his buddies in a K-pop life jacket was right there, and he reached out and he touched him and just toppled over, said he was gone from the waist down.
Another killer, salt water, tempting to drink, deadly if you did.
I seen guys go out of their mind completely.
But perhaps the biggest killer was the failure of the U.S. Navy to even realize the Indianapolis was missing. That, more than anything, bothers the survivors. Survivors who clung to rafts or life jackets or just swam, clinging only to hope.
I wanted to live,
But the Navy did nothing for 5 days.
About the 3rd day, that's when guys start giving up. Well, they left us there, you hear the guy, what's happened? They're not looking for us.
Time got to where it didn't mean that much. We just knew we might not have much of it left.
Only after a patrol plane spotted survivors by accident did rescue efforts begin.
I think the group I was with, we started out with 121 men in 4 days, and 5 nights later, I think there were only 20 of us left.
Actually, the Navy top brass did do one thing. After the fact, they blamed the captain.
My father was a scapegoat.
Captain Charles Butler McVeigh was the only U.S. Navy commander ever court-martialed over the loss of his ship. McVeigh was convicted for failure to have his cruiser zigzag through open seas, supposedly a defense mechanism against submarines, even though the Japanese sub-commander who sank the Indy testified in the court-martial that zigzagging would not have made one bit of difference.
And the Navy had made so many mistakes on this whole thing that they couldn't admit to it. And so they had to have someone to blame. They blamed Dad, and Dad was blameless.
Captain Charles McVeigh was Navy through and through, son of an admiral, grandson of an admiral. The Indianapolis had just completed a top-secret mission carrying components of the atomic bomb to the island of Tinian. The Indy was on its way to the Philippines next, but the Navy never told McVeigh that Japanese submarines had been confirmed in the area and did not provide an anti-submarine destroyer escort.
She was a dead duck.
was the first one to know it was the Indianapolis. He says, I'm Captain Charles McVeigh of the Indianapolis. I need to see your skipper immediately.
On board the rescue ship, Captain McVeigh stayed with his sailors, turning down an offer of a special VIP bunk.
He'd be rubbing some fella's foot gently, you know, or something, and here was the skipper doing this.
Popularity, respect, and the tradition of the McVeigh name may have helped a little. Despite his court-martial, McVeigh was allowed to stay in the Navy. However, his career was ruined.
And he carried the burden of that till his death.
That death came in 1968, when Captain Charles Butler McVeigh put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. A fate which still haunts McVeigh's men who spent months with him on the Indy and 5 days with him in the Pacific.
With 100%, we all back the captain, the survivors.
And it's not just survivors who back McVeigh and blame the Navy. It's relatives of the victims in Cincinnati.
And they left these guys go out in that water, it was sad, and be massacred, and then left them out there to die. And that's what they did. They went out there to die. It must have been horrible.
Don Gottman was a 14-year-old kid in Price Hill, a kid who idolized his big brother Paul.
This is Paul and me.
Paul Gottman joined the Navy as soon as he could in 1944. So did Paul's cousin, also a Price Hill teenager, Ralph Priestley.
And they joined together, and they were inseparable. Just got these pictures. They always got their arm around each other. They were like brothers.
Like the Kogler brothers from Wyoming, cousins Paul and Ralph from Price Hill ended up on the Indianapolis too, and died that horrible night, or maybe in the water a day or so later. No one knows. Ralph Priestley's brother Norb hopes at least it was quick for Ralph, a radio man.
That's my brother, yeah. One fellow told me that if he was on duty that night at that time, he said, you don't have to worry, because that got it. That's where the first one hit, and they really got it.
Norb Priestley was in the Army in Germany and did not find out about the Indianapolis for several weeks. But Don Gottman was a kid at home with his mom when some news filtered in.
And I said, what's wrong? And they said, Paul and Ralph are missing in action. That's all we knew. That's all the details we got.
The days dragged on. Then on the very same day, word came of Japan's surrender. Also came confirmation of the Indianapolis. On page 1 of a newspaper delivered by a 14-year-old paperboy named Don Gottman.
This corner here, that's how we found out what happened to Paul and Ralph. Out of the paper. That was the day the war ended. I delivered this paper, yes.
And so while America rejoiced over the end of the war, the Gottmans and the Priestleys mourned.
Yeah, we're all celebrating, horns blowing. And I remember we were sitting on the porch, and they'd come down the street and pass our house, and they'd stop blowing the horns. They knew Paul, you know, and they felt bad for us, you know. But everybody was celebrating, and we were sad.
Word of the Cincinnati fatalities kept mounting, 7, 9, a dozen. In Wyoming, 2 boys embraced their mother.
Telegram came, you know, and of course she was very upset. I remember that much. And then the lady next door came over, and then the Eddingtons came over, you know, people like that, just to be with her. And I remember that, sitting out on the porch and we're crying. I remember that much.
But even if some memories are a bit dim, after all, it's been nearly 6 decades, it does not take too much to bring everything back.
My second son looks a lot like his grandfather.
There are other ways to keep the memories going. A Purple Heart, a postcard.
These are postcards. We got a few from him. Dear Billy and Denny, I wanted to send you this picture of sailors. Be a good boy and help Mother, and then you'll be helping me. Lots of love from Daddy to my boys. See you soon, Dad.
Physical reminders are special.
That was his Navy white. And before he shipped out, he sent it home. This is all we got from him. He was my buddy.
And there's one more piece of memory, a piece of paper which survivors' relatives hold on to. Relatives who do not know each other. Relatives from Price Hill, from Wyoming. Something they keep in common.
What it says here, I deeply regret to inform you that your husband...
I deeply regret to inform you that a careful review of all facts available
relating to the disappearance of your husband
previously reported missing leads to
the conclusion
that there is no hope for his survival.
880 telegrams, all the same.
And that he lost his life as a result of enemy action on 30 July
1945, while in the service of his country.
All about somebody's father.
I'm not sure what influence Dad would have had on us, but I'm sure it would have been a good one.
Somebody's husband, somebody's son, somebody's brother.
It hurt, you know what I mean?
Eugene W. Jensen.
They are all honored by their families and by their shipmates. Fewer shipmates each year.
Charles B. McKissick.
But even after all the survivors are gone, this memorial will remain to brave men now resting with honor and in peace.
Oh, hear us when we cry to thee for those in peril on the sea.
Jeff Hirsh, 12 News.
The Indianapolis survivors have scored one major success. In October 2000, 55 years after the Indy went down, the U.S. Congress passed a resolution clearing Captain Charles Butler McVeigh of any blame in the sinking of the ship. However, the Navy is still refusing to wipe McVeigh's court-martial conviction from the record. After the break, the issues faced by today's veterans and the work of the DAV to help them. Between April 6, 1917 and November the 11th, 1918, more than 6,000 Cincinnatians joined the stream of 4 million Americans who responded to the call to stop the Kaiser. Almost all left for duty young and idealistic. Everyone was changed. Thousands found themselves thrown in the front, facing machine guns, clinging to gas masks. While recovering from wounds inflicted by an exploding shell just a day before the armistice, Robert Marks recognized the needs of all injured vets. When he returned to Cincinnati, Marks organized the Disabled American Veterans. Welcome back. Since Robert Marks founded the DAV after World War I, the organization's national headquarters has always been in Greater Cincinnati, and since the 1960s in Cold Springs, Kentucky. To talk about about veterans issues in 2003 and the work of the DAV, I am joined by Gary Weaver, the National Director of Communications for the Disabled American Veterans. Gary, welcome to Newsmakers.
Dan, thank you for having me.
There is a federal agency, cabinet-level agency, Veterans Administration. Why do we need the DAV? What's the DAV do? What do you provide that the Veterans Administration doesn't?
Well, the DAV's main purpose, of course, is to build better lives for America's disabled veterans and their families. You have to realize that veterans' benefits, pension, compensation, medical care, is not provided automatically. A veteran must apply for these benefits, these pension and compensation. They're not granted automatically. So we have, across the country, 270 national service officers who are trained extensively in the rules and regulations as they apply to VA health care to assist veterans filing their claims before the Department of Veterans Affairs so they can get this care that they've earned that they need desperately in many cases.
So that's really the basic task of your organization, is to make sure that the individual veteran gets the care that they're promised by the government.
The care
correct?
that they're entitled, that they've earned, certainly by their service to our country. Yes, it's essentially our purpose. Now, there are other services and programs that we offer, but our purpose, our main focus, is to serve those veterans who need help through the Department of Veterans Affairs.
We know in the past 4 or 5 months with the war in Iraq, a lot of news coming out of Iraq particularly about men and women who have been killed, either during the active part of the war before May 1, yes, or since then, and especially in the last few weeks, we know that the increasing attacks. I'm not sure that we've heard as much about people who have been injured, maybe not killed, but injured. What kind of levels are we talking about there?
Well, it's sad to report, the consequences of war are often tragic. People die, people are injured, and that's no less true in what's going on in Iraq as well as Afghanistan. Our best estimates from the U.S. Central Command and the Defense Department indicate that perhaps more than 1,500 men and women have been injured thus far in the conflict in Iraq alone. And these kinds of injuries are more devastating to the extent that they're what we call blast wounds as a consequence of rocket-propelled grenades and mortars and electronically controlled mines that are creating amputations of the arms and the feet and the legs at a much higher rate than we saw in Vietnam or the Persian Gulf War. due to the nature of these injuries. Much more devastating than, say, a bullet wound to the arm or the leg. These blast wounds are creating many, many severe injuries to our veterans.
Am I right? Is there a sense, though, that we don't hear about this that much?
I think you're correct. There's a sense that, that we hear more of the deaths, unfortunately, but those wounded aren't reported as on an equal basis. There are approximately 10 soldiers being injured a day in Iraq alone.
Now, the care that they would receive when they're still in the military, I would assume they're being airlifted out of Iraq, they're being, I don't know, to Germany? Are they coming back to the United States right away? What's happening to people who are injured?
Many of them, Dan, of course, are treated in Iraq. Others are flown to Landstuhl Air Base in Germany for treatment, and then further treatment in the United States at Walter Reed Army Hospital and the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. They're treating, those two hospitals primarily are the focus of care for veterans returning from Iraq.
Now, does your organizations, the DAV, get in touch with military personnel while they're still in the service and being treated, or is it you pick up your concerns and your activity after they've been discharged?
No, we try to contact these veterans as soon as we are able to, because there's that continuum of care. Once they're released from the military, if they are released, some of course are treated, their wounds are such that they're treated and returned to active duty. But for many of those who are severely injured and are medically discharged, of course, then we follow them up and get them into the VA healthcare system as soon as possible. But there's a problem, a serious problem in VA healthcare funding today because it's a discretionary funding system. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs is doing a wonderful job, and he's got a dedicated core of professionals helping him throughout the VA medical care system. But they must compete currently with other federal agencies for very scarce federal funding. It's a discretionary system, as I said. Our organization, the Disabled American Veterans, along with the two other largest veteran service organizations in the country, that being the Veterans of Foreign Wars and the American Legion, total membership there approximately 7 million. We are supporting strongly a mandatory health care funding act. That act would simply assign, I say simply, it's not so simple, but would assign cost at the average cost it takes to take care of a veteran as opposed to a discretionary number. And that would alleviate a lot of the problem. The VA's budget is approximately $25 billion. We need about $27 billion to adequately take care of the veterans in the system. Another thing to note, because of shortfalls in dollars, right now there are approximately 300,000 veterans, men and women, waiting for appointments in VA medical centers across this country. And nearly half of those men and women will have to wait 6 months or more to get an appointment to see a physician.
Because there's literally not enough physicians available? Is that what the VA system needs? More doctors, more nurses, more healthcare professionals?
All of the above, yes, sir. There's a shortage currently throughout the system. There are approximately 172 medical centers across the country.
And in terms of these budget concerns in Washington, you have an office in Washington. The DAV has an office in Washington that lobbies and goes to the Hill and for legislation. When does all of this sort of effort to try to get that budget in place, are we online for that, or is that going on right now?
It's a bipartisan act that is the mandatory veterans health care funding, and it's an ongoing battle. I mean, for many veterans, we often say the battle never ends, and that's true also not only in their medical care, but in to get adequate funding to help them. And yes, it's an ongoing battle. We do have a lot of support, but it's not adequate yet. We're still fighting for this mandatory funding for health care for veterans.
Gary, I want to let people know if they're interested in finding out more about the services and the work of the Disabled American Veterans, the telephone number locally, the area code is 859-441-7300, and a great deal of information can be found on a very good website at dav.org. Gary, thanks for being with us this morning.
Dan, thank you. It's my pleasure.
And thanks for your work. Thank you for making Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. We leave you this morning with the opening sequence of a DAV video entitled Lest We Forget. Have a good week.